evolution of languages and translation from antiquity to the present. As a starting point, I took Schlager's family tree theory of 8060, which, in parallel with the studies of Darwinian evolutionism, stated that languages were also living organisms that are born, reproduce, and die. Schlager placed at the core of his tree the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European, from which the different language families will then be generated, more and more complex and detached from the mother language. Now let's see what Indo-European and a proto-language are, how we reconstruct them, and how do languages then mutate. First, Filippo Sassetti and then Sir William Jones noted the great similarities between Italian, Greek, and Latin with Sanskrit, the ancient sacred language of the Hindu religion. According to their studies, some European languages and Sanskrit had many similarities, and therefore they must have had a common ancestor, Indo-European. Indo-European is a now extinct language from which all the European, Indian, and Asian languages are derived, and they are divided in 12 groups: Italic, Celtic, and Germanic, Armenian, Albanian, and Greek, Slavic, Indian, Iranian, and Baltic, and two now extinct, Anatolian and Tocharius. So what a proto-language is? A proto-language, as Indo-European, is the original language that constituted the common starting point from which the other historical languages, genetically related to it and to each other, originated and developed. How do we reconstruct the language? With the comparative method, which is divided into 3 phases: internal reconstruction, comparison, and finally evaluation of correspondences and process of reconstructing. The reconstructum is the final result and is therefore the set of the reconstructa, the archetypes of that language itself, obtained by the comparative method. Moreover, a reconstructed language is an artificial laboratory language that doesn't have the natural features of a natural historical language. However, returning to the Schlager's theory, he didn't consider 2 key factors: the fact that languages are constantly evolving and the fact that they are constantly interfere with each other. Therefore, it was his pupil Schmidt who corrected the family tree theory by elaborating the wave theory, which instead also considered mutual influences of languages such as dialect divisions, isoglosses, and areal variants. Finally, to conclude the first part, let's see how languages mutate. There are 5 variations or factors that produce languages. The diachronic variation, that is, the variation related to time. As we move in time, the differences become more and more pronounced. The diatopic variation is the space-related variation because a language changes according to place. The differentiation factor implies a change in the different use of grammar, syntax, morphology, vocabulary, dialects, and pronunciation. The diaphasic variation is the variation related to the stylistic level of language production. A language can change in tone or level depending on the situation in which it's used. The diastratic variation is the variation related to the social and cultural level of the language user, because within a society, not all individuals express themselves in the same way. The last one is the diamesic variation and is the variation related to the way of transmission of a language, which can be written or spoken. Written language is more controlled, more organized, and more precise than spoken language, which is subject to more variation and is less controlled. Since ancient times, the basic problem of translation has been fidelity. How faithful should the target text be to the source text? Already in the classical world, there was a debate about which kind of translation was preferable, whether a free translation or a literal translation more faithful to the original. However, it was only during the 20th century that Jacobson distinguished and proposed three different types of translation. Interlingual translation, the actual translation, which consists of finding the equivalent of an element of one linguistic code in another linguistic code. Intralingual translation, which consists in reformulating a text in the same code in which it was originally composed through a re-elaboration. And finally, intersemiotic translation, which consists of interpreting a linguistic code using a non-linguistic code. Jacobson's theoretical assumptions also help us to understand which is the job of the translator. The translator's first job is to decode the prototext. Every single lexical and translation choice is based on the postulates of meaning, that is, the identification of which of the meanings of the prototext signifier was the one really intended by the author, immediately followed by the choice of the translating signifier, which, among its meanings, contains the one that is closest to the original, from the point of view of its semantic value, its use, and its stylistic register. However, even considering this, there are always translation difficulties, and they increase mainly for three reasons. The presence of ambiguity in the prototext, for example polysemy, that is, the coexistence of different meanings for the same term or expression, and for linguistic and cultural distance. It was soon realized that the translation difficulty actually increases more with cultural distance than with linguistic distance, due to the lack of known or existing reference in the two cultures. In fact, realia are those terms that indicate specific objects of a certain culture, for which it is extremely difficult to find an equivalent in the language of a different culture, because the equivalent doesn't exist, or because of the absence in the target language of the concrete reference to which the source language referred. The main translation solutions used to translate realia are the following: with a transcription, so transcribing the original word character by character, considering it as a real lexical loan; with a structural calque, creating a new compound by literally translating it; with explanation, trying to coin a complex expression explaining it; with an hypernym, that is the term semantically superordinate to the term to be translated; and finally with an approximation. In this case, the translation happens by implementing a substitution by approximation similar to the solution with the hypernym. The translation theory made the original position between free and literal translation pretty outdated, because it's too vague and subjective, and because translation solutions now offer enough tools to be able to perform more flexible translations. However, Torrey during the 80s proposed two interpretative categories, adequacy and acceptability, which somehow express the new translator's dilemma. Adequacy is when the translator's main purpose is to reproduce the integrity of the source text. In this case, the metatext adapts to the prototext, to its language, and to its textual reference culture. With adequacy, the translator is invisible because the empirical reader tends not to notice the presence of the translator in the metatext. However, the main risk of adequacy is that it can create difficulties for the readers if they aren't highly motivated and well informed about the topic of the text. In fact, a translator who is too invisible may leave the reader alone, with the risk that they may fail in decoding much of the meaning of the metatext. Acceptability, on the other hand, is when the main purpose of the translator is to create a metatext that is stylistically and linguistically acceptable and therefore easily accessible for the reader. With acceptability, the translator is visible because in this case the empirical reader continuously notices the translator's interventions within the metatext. However, the main risk of acceptability is that it can even completely erase the traces of the culture of the prototext, creating an almost total translation residue, impoverishing the text itself. In fact, an excessively visible translator, who makes the notes and the introduction their strong point, interferes too much with the nature of the proto-text and with the author's stylistic choice. The continuum on the right somehow sums up all the antinomies observed so far in the thesis. Closed text and open text by Umberto Eco, textual functions identified by Jacobson, denotative and connotative meaning, concrete choices such as monolingual dictionaries and personal knowledge of the context, and adequacy and acceptability. In conclusion, usually the best choice for the translator is to adopt an adaptable translation style that is flexible and changes with the changing needs of the text, of the author, and of the readers, and even according to the different text types and context of reference.